The German fighter pilots circling above Wewak, New Guinea on October 11th, 1943 must have thought they were dreaming. 4 American P-47 Thunderbolts were diving toward their airfield where 40 Japanese fighters sat warming up for takeoff. The odds were 10-1 against the Americans. What happened next would become one of the most lopsided aerial victories of the Pacific War. When the shooting stopped just minutes later, 6 enemy aircraft lay burning on the ground and in the air. The 4 Thunderbolts climbed away without a scratch. The Japanese pilots who survived couldn't understand what had just happened. The Germans who heard about it later didn't believe it. But this was the P-47 Thunderbolt doing exactly what it was designed to do. When American pilots first laid eyes on the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt in late 1942, many of them couldn't believe the Army Air Forces expected them to fly the massive machine into combat. The aircraft was enormous, weighing as much as a medium truck when fully loaded. Ground crews immediately nicknamed it the Jug because it looked like a milk jug with wings attached. Pilots who had trained on nimble fighters like the P-40 Warhawk stared at their new mounts with barely concealed horror. Some joked that in an emergency, they could run around inside the fuselage to hide from enemy fighters. Major Hubert Zemke, who would eventually lead the legendary 56th Fighter Group to become one of the highest-scoring units in Europe, initially wondered if someone in Washington had made a catastrophic mistake. The skepticism only intensified when pilots from the 4th Fighter Group received their Thunderbolts. These men had previously flown with the RAF Eagle squadrons, learning their trade in the elegant Supermarine Spitfire. The Spitfire weighed less than half as much as the P-47 and could turn inside a telephone booth. Veteran pilot Don Blakesley took one look at his new Thunderbolt and declared it ought to be able to dive well, since it certainly couldn't climb. But there was method to the apparent madness. While other nations were still designing lightweight, maneuverable fighters, Republic Aviation's chief designer Alexander Kartveli had made a radical bet. That future air combat would be decided not at treetop level where agility mattered most, but in the thin air above 25,000 feet, where raw power ruled supreme. At the heart of the P-47 sat the most powerful aircraft engine in the world, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. With 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, this mechanical marvel produced over 2,000 horsepower. But the real innovation was the sophisticated turbo supercharger system that allowed the Thunderbolt to maintain its strength at altitudes where other fighters gasped for air. Then there was the armament, 8 Browning M2. 50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing. When a Thunderbolt pilot squeezed the trigger, those 8 guns threw over 12 pounds of projectiles per second at the target. It was like pointing 8 fire hoses of destruction at the enemy, each one spitting out high-velocity rounds that combined armor-piercing capability with devastating explosive and incendiary effects. To put this in perspective, most German fighters carried one 30mm cannon and 2 13mm machine guns. Japanese fighters were even more lightly armed. The P-47 didn't just outgun its opponents, it absolutely overwhelmed them with firepower that could tear apart any aircraft in seconds. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. April 15th, 1943 marked a turning point. Major Don Blakesley, the same pilot who had mocked the P-47's climbing ability, scored the type's first aerial victory when he shot down a Focke-Wulf Fokke W-190 near Dieppe, France. The engagement lasted less than 30 seconds, but it revealed the Thunderbolt's secret weapon, the ability to use superior speed and overwhelming firepower to dominate any fight. Blakesley had positioned his Thunderbolt above the German fighter and used the aircraft's exceptional diving speed to close the distance before his opponent could react. When he opened fire, the devastating salvo from 8 50 caliber machine guns literally tore the Focke-Wulf apart. This single engagement spawned an entirely new tactical doctrine. P-47 pilots learned to ignore the old rules about turning and twisting with enemy fighters. Instead, they climbed high, dove fast, hit hard, and climbed back up before the enemy could respond. The tactic became known as boom and zoom, and it played to every strength the Thunderbolt possessed. The P-47's reputation for toughness became legendary through a series of encounters that defied every assumption about aircraft vulnerability. German ace Heinz Baer, who would eventually score 220 victories during the war, described watching a Thunderbolt absorb direct hits from his Focke-Wulf's 20mm cannons and continue fighting as if nothing had happened. The American pilot didn't just stay in formation, he actually returned fire, forcing Baer to break off when his own aircraft started taking hits. The secret lay in the aircraft's design philosophy. The cockpit was surrounded by armor plating. Critical systems were either protected or duplicated. The massive R-2800 engine served as a 2,400-pound shield protecting the pilot from frontal attacks. Most importantly, the air-cooled radial engine eliminated a fatal vulnerability that plagued liquid-cooled fighters. A single bullet through a coolant line could doom a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf, but the P-47 could fly home with entire cylinders shot away. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Johnson became the living embodiment of this toughness when his P-47 was attacked by Focke-Wulfs over France in June 1943. When the assault ended, Johnson's aircraft had over 200 holes in its wings and fuselage, a destroyed canopy, inoperative controls, and an engine barely running, yet the Thunderbolt brought him home safely. He walked away from the crash landing, but it was in the Pacific Theater where the P-47 delivered perhaps its most stunning demonstration of combat effectiveness. Colonel Neil Kirby commanded the 348th Fighter Group when they brought the first Thunderbolts to New Guinea in the summer of 1943. Pacific Theater commanders were skeptical. Everyone knew that fighting Japanese fighters required maximum agility and minimum weight. Kirby understood his pilots needed entirely new tactics. He studied the reports from Europe and recognized that boom and zoom tactics could be even more effective against Japanese aircraft, which were generally lighter and less protected than their German counterparts. The key was convincing his pilots to resist the temptation to dogfight where the enemy held overwhelming advantages. On October 11, 1943, Kirby led a four-ship formation of P-47 seconds on a fighter sweep over the Japanese airfield at Wewak. The mission began as routine reconnaissance. Then Kirby spotted 40 Japanese aircraft preparing to take off. Despite being outnumbered 10-1, he ordered his pilots to attack. What followed was one of the most remarkable aerial engagements of the war. The four American pilots dove repeatedly into the Japanese formation, using superior speed and devastating firepower to destroy 6 enemy aircraft without suffering a single loss. Kirby himself accounted for 4 of the destroyed aircraft during the engagement. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was enormous. Even their most experienced units could be overwhelmed by properly flown American fighters. More importantly, it proved the P-47 could be just as deadly against Japanese aircraft as it had been against German opponents. German and Japanese pilots learned to dread a distinctive sound, the roar of 8 50-caliber machine guns opening fire in unison. The combined rate of fire was devastating. Each gun cycled at 800 rounds per minute, meaning all 8 together pumped out more than 6,000 rounds per minute at the target. The ammunition itself was deadly. Armor-piercing rounds could punch through engine blocks and armored cockpits. Incendiary rounds could ignite fuel tanks with a single hit. Tracer rounds allowed pilots to walk their fire onto target with terrifying accuracy. The mixture of ammunition types meant that every burst was likely to cause catastrophic damage. Luftwaffe maintenance reports show a consistent pattern. Aircraft returning from combat with damage suggesting they'd been hit by weapons much larger than 50-caliber machine guns. Japanese pilots reported similar experiences, describing how P-47 seconds could destroy their aircraft with shorter bursts than any other enemy fighter they'd encountered. The P-47's versatility extended beyond pure fighter missions. Its robust construction and heavy firepower made it surprisingly effective against ground targets. Pilots discovered they could attack trains, truck convoys, and airfields with devastating results. The addition of external bomb racks and rocket launchers transformed the Thunderbolt into a deadly fighter bomber. Between D-Day and VE Day, Thunderbolt pilots claimed destruction of over 86,000 railroad cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles, and 68,000 trucks. While these figures likely included some overclaims, the scale of destruction suggests P-47 units made significant contributions to crippling German logistics during the final year of the war. In the Pacific, P-47 seconds proved equally capable. The 318th Fighter Group flew missions lasting over 8 hours against targets throughout the Japanese home islands. These long-range strikes demonstrated the strategic reach that made the Thunderbolt so valuable in the vast Pacific theater. The statistical record tells the story. Over 15,600 P-47 seconds were built during the war. They flew 746,000 combat sorties and claimed 3,752 aerial victories. The overall loss rate was just 0.7% per mission, remarkably low for such an active aircraft type. The aerial kill ratio of 4.6 to 1 compared favorably with any fighter of the war. The 56th Fighter Group, which remained equipped with P-47 seconds throughout the European war by choice, compiled 677.5 aerial victories and 311 ground kills. The top 3 American aces in the European theatre all flew P-47 seconds with this unit: Francis Gabreski with 28 victories, Robert Johnson with 27, and David Schilling with 22.5. So what happened to all those pilots who laughed at the P-47 when they first saw it? Most of them became converts after their first combat mission. They learned that air combat wasn't about dancing with the enemy, it was about using every advantage to win decisively and survive to fight another day. The German and Japanese pilots, who initially dismissed the massive American fighter, learned a harder lesson. Weight didn't matter when you had power. Maneuverability didn't matter when you controlled the altitude and speed of engagement. Nothing mattered when 8 50 caliber machine guns were shredding your aircraft to pieces. The P-47 Thunderbolt didn't just survive the war, it dominated the skies wherever it flew. It proved that sometimes the best fighter isn't the one that dances the prettiest, but the one that hits the hardest and refuses to go down. By the time the last Thunderbolt rolled off the production line in October 1945, Republic Aviation had created more than a successful fighter. They'd created a legend that would influence military aviation for generations to come. The thunder that first rolled across European and Pacific skies in 1943 echoed through the jet age and beyond, reminding everyone that sometimes the biggest, toughest fighter wins by simply refusing to lose. The P-47's effectiveness didn't go unnoticed by America's allies. The Royal Air Force, initially skeptical about American fighter designs, ordered over 800 Thunderbolts for operations in Burma. British pilots who had mastered the Spitfire and Hurricane quickly discovered that the massive American fighter was perfectly suited for the brutal conditions of Southeast Asia. Squadron leader David Lord commanded No. 123, Squadron RAF, during operations against Japanese forces in Burma. In his official reports, he called the P-47 the most effective ground attack aircraft his unit had operated during the entire war. The combination of heavy firepower, robust construction, and long range made it ideal for missions against Japanese supply lines deep in remote jungle areas where a damaged aircraft might have to fly hundreds of miles to reach safety. British pilots learned to appreciate what their American counterparts already knew. The P-47 could take a beating and keep flying. In the humid, corrosive environment of Burma, where maintenance was a constant challenge, the Thunderbolt's reliability became its most valued characteristic. Aircraft that flew through monsoons, operated from muddy airstrips, and absorbed ground fire from hidden Japanese positions continued to perform mission after mission. Even the Soviet Union, which generally preferred domestically produced aircraft, operated over 200 P-47 seconds during the final years of the war. Soviet test pilot Alexei Grinchik flew some of the first Thunderbolts delivered to the USSR and reported that while the aircraft was stable and comfortable, its weight made it less suitable for the low-altitude close air support missions that formed the backbone of Soviet tactical aviation. The Soviets assigned most of their P-47 seconds to high-altitude air defense missions over major cities, where the aircraft's ceiling and speed advantages could be fully utilized against German high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft. It was a practical decision that recognized the Thunderbolt's strengths, even if it didn't perfectly align with Soviet operational doctrine. Perhaps the most remarkable Allied operations came from unexpected quarters. The Brazilian Expeditionary Air Force operated 48 P-47Ds during the Italian campaign, flying 445 combat missions between November 1944 and May 1945. The first Brazilian fighter group was integrated into the U.S. 350th Fighter Group, and these South American pilots quickly earned a reputation for aggressiveness that impressed their American counterparts. Captain Rui Moreira Lima commanded the Brazilian P-47 unit during its combat deployment. In his post-war memoirs, he wrote that the Thunderbolt's durability was crucial to his unit's survival during missions over heavily defended German positions in northern Italy. Several of his aircraft returned from combat with damage that would have been fatal to lighter fighters: holes in vital structures, damaged control systems, engines barely running, yet the pilots made it home safely. The Brazilian government didn't forget these contributions. Decades later, in the early 1982, they awarded the Presidential Unit Citation to this unit in recognition of their role in the Allied victory. 15 aircraft were lost to German anti-aircraft fire during operations, but the courage and skill of these Brazilian pilots demonstrated that the P-47's effectiveness transcended national boundaries. The Mexican Expeditionary Air Force wrote an even more remarkable chapter. The 201st Fighter Squadron operated P-47Ds as part of the U.S. 5th Air Force during operations in the Philippines in 1945, flying 791 combat sorties against Japanese targets. They achieved something extraordinary. Not a single pilot or aircraft was lost to enemy action. Major Eduardo Año commanded the Mexican P-47 unit and noted in his official reports that the aircraft's reliability and ease of maintenance were crucial factors in this perfect combat record. Operating from primitive airfields under tropical conditions that were extremely harsh on equipment, the Mexican pilots found their Thunderbolts required less maintenance and suffered fewer mechanical failures than other fighters operating in the same theater. While air-to-air combat showcased the P-47's strengths, it was in the ground attack role that the Thunderbolt truly revolutionized tactical aviation. The transition from pure fighter to fighter-bomber happened almost by accident when early European units discovered their aircraft's robust construction and heavy firepower made them surprisingly effective against ground targets during return flights from bomber escort missions. What started as opportunistic attacks on targets of opportunity evolved into a systematic campaign of destruction against German transportation and logistics. The adoption of external bomb racks and 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets transformed the P-47 into a weapon system that could carry up to 2,500 pounds of external ordnance while retaining full air-to-air combat capability. Those 5-inch rockets carried the explosive power of a 105mm artillery shell. A single P-47 could engage targets that previously required entire squadrons of lighter fighters to suppress. Combined with 8 50-caliber machine guns, these weapons gave Thunderbolt pilots the ability to destroy virtually any target they could reach. The Normandy invasion in June 1944 put these capabilities to the ultimate test. The 9th Air Force operated more than 1,000 P-47 seconds during the opening phases of Operation Overlord, flying multiple missions per day in support of advancing infantry and armor units. The ability to shift rapidly between air superiority and ground attack missions allowed tactical commanders to concentrate firepower where it was needed most. Lieutenant Colonel Quentin Arnenson flew P-47 seconds with the 391st Fighter Squadron during the Normandy campaign. He later described the intensity of operations during the weeks following D-Day. His unit flew as many as 3 combat missions per day, alternating between bomber escort duties, fighter sweeps, and close air support sorties depending on the tactical situation. The reliability and durability of the P-47 made this punishing operational tempo possible. The close air support missions revealed another dimension of the P-47's effectiveness that hadn't been anticipated by its designers. The accuracy with which Thunderbolt pilots could preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. To deliver weapons against small tactical targets was remarkable for an aircraft originally designed as a high-altitude interceptor. The stable gun platform provided by the heavy airframe allowed pilots to track moving targets even during high-speed strafing runs. Captain Tom Glenn flew P-47 seconds with the 365th Fighter Group during the European campaign. In his post-war memoir, he wrote about the psychological challenges of ground attack missions. The most difficult aspect, he explained, was the intimacy of the combat. Pilots could clearly see the results of their attacks on enemy personnel and equipment. Unlike high-altitude bombing, where targets were reduced to abstract dots on the landscape, strafing runs brought pilots close enough to see individual soldiers and vehicles. It made the human cost of war impossible to ignore. Yet, the missions continued because they were devastatingly effective at disrupting German military operations. The numbers speak for themselves. Between D-Day and VE Day, Thunderbolt pilots claimed destruction of over 86,000 railroad cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles, and 68,000 trucks. Even accounting for the inevitable overclaims common with air-to-ground statistics, the scale of destruction suggests P-47 units made significant contributions to the collapse of German logistics during the final year of the war. In the Pacific, the P-47 Newton's variant demonstrated capabilities that seemed impossible for a single-engine fighter. The 318th Fighter Group operated these extended-range Thunderbolts from Ieshima during the final months of the war against Japan, flying missions that lasted over 8 hours against targets throughout the Japanese home islands. These marathon flights required not just mechanical reliability, but extraordinary pilot endurance. Sitting in a cramped cockpit for 8 hours while maintaining combat readiness demanded physical and mental stamina that few aircraft could support. The P-47 Newtons' improved high-altitude performance and extended fuel capacity made these strategic strikes possible. Oscar Perdomo, a pilot with the 464th Fighter Squadron, achieved a rare distinction on August 13, 1945, when he shot down 5 Japanese aircraft during a single combat mission over Kyushu, becoming an ace in a day. The achievement was remarkable, not only for its rarity, but also because it occurred during the final phase of the war, when experienced Japanese pilots had become increasingly scarce. The combat report noted that Perdomo had engaged a mixed formation of Japanese Army and Navy fighters, suggesting that Japanese air defenses were becoming desperately disorganized as American bombing campaigns intensified. Even in the war's closing days, the P-47 continued to demonstrate its lethality. Alexander Kartveli, the Georgian immigrant who designed the P-47, lived to see his radical concepts vindicated beyond his wildest expectations. His design philosophy built a fighter around the most powerful engine available and make it strong enough to absorb punishment that would destroy lesser aircraft had proven correct in every combat theatre. Kartveli understood something that many of his contemporaries missed, that aerial battles of modern warfare would be fought not at treetop level, where maneuverability mattered most, but in the thin air above 25,000 feet, where engine power and structural strength determined victory or defeat. The sophisticated turbo-supercharger system that allowed the P-47 to maintain strength at extreme altitudes was the key to this philosophy. But Kartveli's influence extended far beyond World War II. He continued to shape American fighter development through his work on jets like the F-84 Thunderjet and F-105 Thunderchief. The design philosophy that emphasized ruggedness and firepower over agility became a hallmark of Republic aviation products throughout the Cold War era. The F-105, which bore a clear family resemblance to the original Thunderbolt, proved equally capable during the Vietnam War. Its ability to absorb battle damage and deliver heavy weapons loads made it one of the most effective aircraft in the American inventory during that conflict. The lineage was unmistakable from P-47 to F-105. The Republic philosophy remained consistent. The technical innovations that made the P-47 successful influenced fighter design for decades. The turbo supercharger system became standard equipment on many post-war American fighters, including the F-84 and F-86 Sabre. The emphasis on pilot protection and aircraft survivability became fundamental principles of American fighter development, leading to aircraft like the A-10 Thunderbolt II that carried these concepts even further. Even the armament evolved from P-47 principles. The .50 caliber machine gun that proved so devastating on the Thunderbolt became standard fighter armament for most Western air forces during the early jet age. The reliability and destructive power of the Browning M2, combined with improved ammunition types developed during World War II, provided weapons that remained effective well into the missile age. The manufacturing techniques developed to produce over 15,600 P-47 seconds in less than 4 years revolutionized American aircraft production. Republic Aviation's Farmingdale facility became one of the most efficient production centers in the world, with assembly line techniques that reduced build time from hundreds of hours to dozens. These quality control procedures became standard throughout the American aircraft industry. By the time the last P-47 rolled off the production line in October 1945, Republic Aviation had created more than a successful fighter aircraft. They had established a new template for what air power could accomplish when properly designed and employed. The lessons learned from this remarkable aircraft would continue to influence military aviation for generations. The thunder that first rolled across European and Pacific skies in 1943 never really stopped. It echoed through the jet age in aircraft like the F-84, F-105, and even the modern A-10. Every time an American pilot climbs into a rugged, heavily armed fighter designed to absorb punishment and deliver overwhelming firepower, they're flying a direct descendant of Alexander Kartvel's revolutionary concept. The German and Japanese pilots who first encountered P-47 seconds learned a lesson that would reshape aerial warfare, that survivability and firepower could trump maneuverability when combined with proper tactics and superior technology. The American pilots who flew Thunderbolts learned that courage and skill mattered more when backed by an aircraft that refused to let them down. In the end, the P-47 Thunderbolt succeeded because it embodied a fundamentally different approach to fighter design. Instead of building the lightest and most maneuverable aircraft possible, Kartveli created a fighter that was heavier and more powerful than anything that had come before. The result was an aircraft that could fight effectively where conventional fighters struggled, while providing protection and firepower that made survival possible even in the most hostile environments. The laughter of those skeptical pilots who first saw the massive Jug in 1942 faded quickly once they experienced what 8 .50 caliber machine guns could do to an enemy formation. The P-47 Thunderbolt didn't just win battles, it changed the fundamental nature of air combat, proving that sometimes the biggest hammer wins the fight. While other units transitioned to the P-51 Mustang as soon as they could, one group refused to give up their Thunderbolts. The 56th Fighter Group remained equipped with P-47 seconds throughout the entire European war, not because they had to, but because they chose to. Their reasoning was simple. They had mastered the aircraft and knew exactly how to extract maximum performance from the massive Republic fighter. The results speak for themselves. The 56th compiled 677.5 aerial victories and 311 ground kills, achieved at the cost of 128 aircraft lost to all causes. They became the highest-scoring fighter group in the 8th Air Force, proving that in the hands of skilled pilots who understood its capabilities, the P-47 could dominate any opponent. What made the 56th special wasn't just their aircraft, it was their tactical discipline. Under the leadership of commanders like Hubert Zemke and David Schilling, the group developed and refined boom and zoom tactics, to a level of sophistication that other units struggled to match. They understood that every advantage, altitude, speed, position, surprise, had to be carefully managed and exploited. The top 3 American aces in the European theatre all flew P-47 seconds with the 56th Fighter Group. Francis Gabreski scored 28 victories, Robert Johnson claimed 27. David Schilling achieved 22.5. These weren't lucky pilots who happened to encounter more enemies. They were tactical masters who used the P-47's strengths to create opportunities that other pilots couldn't see. Francis "Gabby" Gabreski exemplified what a skilled pilot could accomplish with the P-47. During his 166 combat missions with the 56th Fighter Group, Gabreski developed tactics that maximized the Thunderbolt's advantages while minimizing its limitations. His technique of using altitude and speed to control the timing and location of combat engagements became standard doctrine for P-47 units throughout the war. Gabreski's approach was methodical and deliberate. He avoided the impulsive attacks that got so many fighter pilots killed. Instead, he positioned his aircraft for maximum advantage before committing to combat, using the P-47's superior high-altitude performance to gain the initiative. Once he dove into an attack, his 8 .50 caliber machine guns made short work of any target. His career nearly ended in July 1944 when he was shot down over Germany and spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner. But Gabreski's story didn't end with World War II. He returned to active duty and eventually became an ace again, flying F-86 Sabres during the Korean War, proving that the tactical skills he developed in the P-47 translated perfectly to jet combat. The fact that Gabreski could transition from propeller-driven Thunderbolts to jet-powered Sabres and achieve ace status in both speaks volumes about the fundamental soundness of the tactics developed for the P-47. Energy management, positioning, and disciplined attacks worked regardless of the aircraft type. If Gabreski was the tactical genius, Robert Johnson was the indestructible warrior who proved the P-47 could survive anything. His 91 combat missions included 43 encounters with German fighters, and he fired his guns on 36 of those occasions. Post-war analysis of German records suggested Johnson may have achieved as many as 32 aerial victories, potentially making him the highest-scoring P-47 pilot of the European War. But Johnson's greatest contribution to P-47 legend wasn't his victory total, it was his ability to bring damaged aircraft home safely. Time and again, he survived encounters that should have been fatal, demonstrating the Thunderbolt's legendary toughness to pilots throughout the 8th Air Force. The most famous incident occurred on that June day in 1943 when Focke-Wulf 192nd attacked his aircraft over France. When the assault ended, Johnson's P-47 was a flying wreck. More than 200 holes punctured the wings and fuselage. The canopy was destroyed. Control surfaces barely responded. The engine was barely running. Oil and hydraulic fluid leaked from multiple ruptures. Any rational pilot would have bailed out. Johnson stayed with the aircraft, nursing it across the English Channel through sheer determination and skill. When he finally crash-landed at his base, ground crews couldn't believe anyone had survived. The aircraft was written off as too damaged to repair, but Johnson walked away without serious injury. Stories like this spread through P-47 units like wildfire, building confidence among pilots who knew they were flying into heavily defended airspace. The knowledge that their aircraft could absorb tremendous punishment and still bring them home made pilots more willing to press attacks and complete missions. Johnson's survival wasn't just a personal victory, it was a propaganda coup that boosted morale throughout the 8th Air Force. The psychological impact of the P-47's 8 .50 caliber machine guns extended far beyond their physical destructive power. German and Japanese pilots learned to recognize the distinctive sound of all 8 guns firing in unison, a sound that meant death was coming at over 6,000 rounds per minute. Luftwaffe pilot Kurt Bühligen, who eventually scored 112 aerial victories, described the frustration of fighting P-47 seconds in post-war interviews with Allied intelligence officers. According to Bühligen, German pilots quickly learned that attacking a Thunderbolt was likely to result in a prolonged engagement that would drain their limited fuel reserves and expose them to attacks from other American fighters. The standard German tactic of making a single high-speed pass and escaping before the enemy could react simply didn't work against aircraft that could survive the initial attack and pursue their attackers at high speed. Worse, if a German pilot missed with his first burst, he faced the terrifying prospect of having 8 .50 caliber machine guns tracking him as he tried to escape. Japanese pilots faced similar challenges. Major Moroku Yashinichi, commander of the 248th Sentai of the Japanese Army Air Force, noted in his combat reports that while Japanese pilots could still achieve tactical victories under favorable circumstances, the P-47's speed and altitude performance made it virtually impossible to prevent American bomber formations from reaching their targets. The strategic implication was devastating. Even when Japanese or German pilots won individual engagements, they were losing the broader air war because they couldn't stop the relentless American bombing campaigns. The P-47's ability to escort bombers deep into enemy territory while maintaining enough performance to engage defending fighters fundamentally altered the balance of air power. The success of P-47 operations depended not just on the aircraft's capabilities, but on comprehensive training programs that taught pilots how to fly and fight effectively in the massive fighter. The training philosophy emphasized energy management and tactical discipline concepts that became fundamental elements of fighter pilot education throughout the jet age. New P-47 pilots learned that altitude was life. They trained relentlessly on climbing to advantage positions before engaging the enemy. They practiced boom and zoom attacks until the tactics became instinctive. They learned to resist the temptation to dogfight, understanding that the P-47's strengths lay in speed and firepower rather than turning ability. Gunnery training focused on making the most of those 8. Pilots learned to hold their fire until they were certain of hitting the target, then delivering short, devastating bursts that conserved ammunition while maximizing destructive effect. The goal wasn't to spray bullets wildly, it was to put concentrated firepower on target with surgical precision. Many of the commanders who led American air forces during the Cold War had learned their trade flying Thunderbolts during World War II. They brought with them the lessons of that earlier conflict, the importance of robust aircraft design, the value of overwhelming firepower, and the need for tactical discipline that emphasized using every advantage to achieve victory while minimizing losses. The P-47's combat career didn't end with World War II. The aircraft's fundamental soundness and versatility ensured it remained in service with air forces around the world for decades after the war ended. These post-war operations demonstrated that the design concepts Alexander Kartveli had pioneered in the early 1940s remained relevant in vastly different operational environments. The Turkish Air Force operated 180 P-47Ds from 1948 to 1954, using them primarily for ground attack and training missions along the nation's borders with the Soviet Union during the early Cold War. Turkish pilots praised the aircraft's stability and predictable handling characteristics, which made it an ideal platform for pilots transitioning from training aircraft to high-performance fighters. The Peruvian Air Force operated P-47 seconds until 1966, making it one of the last military services to retire the type from frontline service. Peruvian pilots used their Thunderbolts for both air defense and counterinsurgency operations in remote areas of the Andes Mountains. The high-altitude performance that had made the P-47 so effective during World War II proved equally valuable in the thin air of high-altitude airfields throughout Peru and Bolivia. The aircraft's ruggedness and ability to operate from short, improvised airstrips made it invaluable for operations in areas where infrastructure was limited. Even 20 years after the war ended, the P-47 remained a capable combat aircraft when operated in environments that played to its strengths. The technical innovations pioneered in the P-47 influenced not just fighter design, but broader aerospace engineering principles. The turbo-supercharger system that gave the Thunderbolt its high-altitude performance became standard equipment on many post-war aircraft, both military and civilian. The lessons learned about managing high-altitude flight contributed to the development of pressurized cockpits and improved oxygen systems that made high-altitude operations safer and more effective. The emphasis on structural strength and system redundancy that characterized the P-47 became fundamental principles of American military aviation. The idea that aircraft should be designed to survive battle damage and continue fighting influenced everything from the A-10 Thunderbolt II to modern fighters like the F-15 Eagle. The manufacturing techniques developed to produce over 15,600 P-47 seconds in less than 4 years represented a revolution in aircraft production. Republic Aviation's ability to maintain quality while dramatically increasing production rates demonstrated that American industry could adapt rapidly to wartime requirements while exceeding the quality standards of established European manufacturers. The quality control procedures developed for P-47 production became standard practice throughout the aerospace industry. The concept of building aircraft on assembly lines with interchangeable parts and rigorous testing at each stage of production ensured that every aircraft met demanding specifications. These practices influenced not just military aviation but commercial aircraft manufacturing as well. One aspect of the P-47 that often gets overlooked in discussions of combat performance was its remarkable reliability. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine proved incredibly dependable in service, requiring less maintenance than comparable power plants while delivering consistent performance across a wide range of operating conditions. This reliability translated directly into operational effectiveness. Units could maintain higher sortie rates because aircraft spent less time undergoing maintenance. Pilots could focus on tactics and combat rather than worrying about mechanical failures. Commanders could plan complex operations with confidence that their aircraft would perform as expected. The air-cooled radial engine design eliminated many of the maintenance headaches associated with liquid-cooled power plants. There were no radiators to leak, no coolant lines to rupture, no complex plumbing systems to maintain. The R2800's relatively simple construction meant that field maintenance crews could perform most repairs without specialized equipment or facilities. This reliability proved especially valuable in the Pacific Theater, where aircraft operated from primitive airfields under harsh tropical conditions. The ability to maintain high operational readiness, despite challenging environmental conditions, gave American forces a significant advantage over Japanese opponents who struggled with maintenance and logistics. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt stands as one of the most successful fighter aircraft of World War II, not because it was the fastest or most maneuverable, but because it was designed around principles that proved fundamentally correct. Alexander Kartvel's vision of a heavily armored fighter optimized for high-altitude combat created an aircraft that could dominate opponents while protecting its pilot. The statistics are impressive: 746,000 combat sorties, 3,752 aerial victories, a kill ratio of 4.6 to 1, and a loss rate of just 0.7% per mission. But the real measure of the P-47's success lies in the confidence it gave to the pilots who flew it. They knew their aircraft could absorb punishment, deliver devastating firepower, and bring them home safely. That confidence translated into aggressive, effective combat operations that helped secure Allied victory. The legacy of the Thunderbolt extends far beyond World War II. Its influence can be seen in every rugged, heavily armed American fighter that followed, from the F-84 Thunderjet to the A-10 Thunderbolt II. The tactical doctrines developed by P-47 pilots became fundamental elements of fighter combat that remain relevant in the modern era. When those German pilots first laughed at the massive American fighter, they couldn't have known they were looking at the future of aerial warfare. The P-47 Thunderbolt didn't just win battles, it redefined what a fighter aircraft could be and what it could accomplish. That's a legacy that continues to thunder through the skies today.